Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the channel. We are now just hours away from the 2020 general election, and this year, the topic of legalizing marijuana is once again a major initiative on the ballot. This year, 4 states will vote on initiatives to legalize recreational marijuana. This includes Arizona, Montana, New Jersey, and South Dakota. All these states have referendums on the official ballot, and polling data does suggest that this topic has the support of the majority of citizens residing in each one of these states. So it may be possible that we may be seeing 4 new states legalizing cannabis this year. 2 other states, South Dakota and Mississippi, will also decide on medical marijuana use. Now, for disclaimer purposes, I must acknowledge that I have no interest in this topic or the legislation because I am a non smoker. I don't smoke marijuana and I don't smoke in general. However, since marijuana is going to be a major topic of conversation over the next year, especially if the Democrats take control of both the White House with the presidency and in the Senate with the majority there, and retain control of the House, we can see substantial progress being made over the next year. And this is why I wanted to discuss this topic in more detail at this time. So, moving on, we see here on the screen a map of the legality of cannabis by state. And in the blue states, you see the that they have legal legislation approving of marijuana use. The green uh, states have legal medical use, and the lighter green also have medical use permissions, but there's a little bit more restrictions with that. The gray has no laws, and it prohibits recreational marijuana use, and the D symbol indicates that they have decriminalized marijuana use. You may see some states that have legal marijuana usage laws, but there's still the criminal element that hasn't necessarily faded from society. Now, um, we all know that ballot initiatives have become more or less a popular way for states to legalize recreational marijuana usage. And this came in effect specifically after the state of Washington and Colorado became the first states to approve legalized cannabis initiatives in 2012. And currently, there are 11 states, and including the District of Columbia, having legalized marijuana laws for recreational purposes. Now, most of this year's marijuana referendums were initiated by citizens who worked to gain signatures to qualify the measure for ballot access. However, specifically in New Jersey, their measure was put on the ballot by the state legislature after Democratic leaders were not able to get the votes last year to pass a bill legalizing marijuana. Now, voters in both Arizona and South Dakota are getting another chance to decide the issue after rejecting previous marijuana legislation measures in the past. In Arizona specifically, voters narrowly rejected a measure to legalize marijuana in 2016, while voters in South Dakota rejected medical cannabis ballots in 2006 and 2010. And again, while polling data does indicate that we could see 4 more states legalizing marijuana this year, there's still a major disconnect with federal law, specifically with the Federal Controlled Substance Act of 1970. The Controlled Substance Act still classifies cannabis as a Schedule 1 substance, which is considered to have a more or less a high potential for abuse and have no accepted medical usage whatsoever, at least according to the act. Now, as we all know, this is not necessarily true anymore. Legal medical use of marijuana has increased over the last decade, and what currently exists is a contradiction of laws between the federal government and our state governments. So, in 2019, following the blue wave during the 2018 midterm elections, Senator Kamala Harris and the current vice presidential candidate for the Democratic Party introduced legislation that would address some of the conflicts between both state and federal law. Now, specifically, Senator Harris introduced what is called the Moores Act of 2019. This act is the longer title, the more formal title is the Marijuana Opportunity Reinvestment and Expungement Act. Now, it does a lot. There's a lot in this act, and there's a lot that we could spend time on, but to give you the main points, um, it was introduced specifically to remove marijuana as a Schedule 1 substance from the Controlled Substance Act of 1970. Now, that's important, and I'll explain that a little bit later, but it's the highlight of the legislation piece. Now, it also proposes that federal courts expunge prior convictions of inmates who were incarcerated because of marijuana-related charges. That's huge. If we're going to decriminalize marijuana, then we also want to expunge the records of people we've convicted under the laws in the past. It's the way to provide healing as a society and to move those people who have been victimized by these types of laws and make them feel productive and accepted members of society once again. Now, the MORE Act of 2019 also authorizes a 5% sales tax on marijuana products. The money specifically generated from this sales tax would, I believe, be directed to an opportunity trust fund, which has about 3 grant programs to help local communities heavily impacted by high incarcerations because of marijuana related charges. It would provide these communities with additional resources such as job training, reentry programs, and literacy programs to help those communities. The money generated would also help assist small business owners and entrepreneurs in the industry who have been identified as socially and economically disadvantaged individuals, at least according to what's listed in the legislation. Now, this act does not, however, immediately legalize marijuana use across the United States. This is the exception to the rule here. We can see that this piece of legislation is basically making marijuana a states' right issue, not a federal issue. The federal government, according to multiple legislators, both Republican and Democrat, has said that the federal government is so far behind on this topic, it's not even funny. So, for the states that did legalize marijuana, there would no longer be a contradiction between what the federal law says and what the local state law says. The MORE Act was introduced into the House in November of 2019 by Representative Jared Nadler, a Democrat from New York's 10th Congressional District, and he also is the chair of the House Judiciary Committee, which has had a few meetings specifically on the MORE Act within the House. Now, there were certain members of Congress who said, we shouldn't really move forward with the MORE Act in the House based off its the way it's currently written. And Representative Nadler told the committee members and the Judiciary Committee that there's a reason why there's 2 different uh, houses, or it's a bicameral legislator, because you propose one thing in the House and the Senate may propose something different, but you come together in conference to resolve those issues. You don't just vote on what you think will pass in the Senate or won't pass in the Senate. And so, again, Representative Nadler emphasized that point, and This is when people try to make an amendment to the MORE Act in the House. He kind of stopped it in its tracks, at least for the time being. So if we want to take a little bit a closer look at what's going on in the legislation, we can pull up govtrack.us, which I referred to in a previous video about looking at specific um, points in the legislation that may have been overlooked at times. So here I have the text of the MORE Act of 2019 that was introduced by Senator Kamala Harris. And it's a pretty long text, and it covers all the points that I mentioned before, specifically the Opportunity Trust Fund, the creation of the trust fund, and some of the expenditures that would go into it. It discusses the tax, the products, and so forth. So it's a very in-depth bill, and I highly recommend that if you have an interest in this topic, that you could see what it does and what it doesn't do, um, beyond what I've already mentioned specifically. Now, in terms of the actions that have been taken so far in the Senate, um, it's been relatively quiet, more or less. There have been just a few co-sponsors, 7 in total, all Democrats, who have sponsored this. And in terms of where it's gone, and it's only been assigned to the Senate Finance Committee. That's it. It hasn't received any other vote. It hasn't received any vote in committee. Um, it's just stuck in the Finance Committee with nowhere to go. Now, in the House, the same act, the MORE Act of 2019, that was taken from, that was introduced by Senator Kamala Harris and then applied to the House by Representative Jared Nadler. Um, Again, it's gone nowhere. It's been introduced to the House Judiciary Committee, to the Energy and Commerce Committee, Education and Labor Committee, Agriculture Committee, Ways and Means Committee, and so forth. And yes, it has more eyes on it and more committees looking at it. But that was in 2019. We've gone all of 2020 with no update. So that doesn't necessarily mean that it's dead in the water. Um, there's other things happening behind the scenes that we can look at. So, for example, in the previous session of Congress, in the 115th session of Congress, they there was the creation of a bipartisan caucus, which was the Congressional Cannabis Caucus. And one of the original co-chairs was Congressman Earl Blumenauer from the 3rd District of Oregon, who's a Democrat. And he kind of created a blueprint for the House Democratic leadership to look at when trying to address marijuana, specifically legalizing marijuana in the current session of Congress. So, again, in 2018, there was a blue wave during the midterm elections that allowed the House to have a majority controlled by the Democrats. And Earl Blumenauer took the initiative to really emphasize a roadmap, and he kind of put in some different elements that everyone can look at. He cited a polling statistic from the Center of American Progress that was dated in June of 2018. And in this poll, it was 1,000 sample size of a national survey conducted online between April 25th and May 1st of 2018. And it basically said that almost 70%, 7 out of 10 Americans of registered voters, support the legalization of marijuana. And he emphasized to the House Democratic leadership that Congress is out of step with the American people and the states on the cannabis issue. And with the win in November of 2018, the midterm elections, Um, the representative stated there's no question anymore that cannabis prohibition will end. And he suggests and encourages the Democrats should lead the way on it. Um, Now, he has some personal opinion in his blueprint, which is fine. That I mean, he created it, and it was a memo specifically for the House Democratic leadership. But he also presented a timeline that he wanted to see. And so, while uh, Representative Blumauer did not introduce specifically the MORE Act like Senator Kamala Harris did, he introduced a different regulation, House Resolution 420. And yes, I see the irony in it. And the title of it was to regulate marijuana like alcohol act. And it was, again, dealing with the decriminalization of marijuana and allowing to be regulated in like other types of things that are regulated for common use for adults, not for children, and so forth. And so his blueprint was more or less designed based off of HR 420, which was introduced on January 9th, 2019, at the beginning of the 116th Congress. But again, its status, it went nowhere. It was stuck in committee, and it just has had no progress since. So back to the timeline that Representative Blumauer created, he suggested that when you look at marijuana use and specifically within the legislation, whatever legislation piece that you have, introduce it to all the committees. The Judiciary Committee, the Veterans Affairs Committee, the Energy and Commerce Committee, Finance Committee, and so forth, Ways and Means. And you may be thinking, why did the Veterans Committee need to look at marijuana use? Well, you need to look at it for those who have served in Congress and served in the military and have been discharged because of marijuana use, or for those who are currently serving in the military and how legal marijuana use is permitted and not permitted within your job as a soldier and so forth. There are different variables that need to be looked at. And it could also be because of benefits too. Um, and Representative Blumauer came up with this roadmap and said that if the work got done and the committees actually took the time to review um, the legislation, then by the end of 2019, and he has here June 2019, um, uh, marijuana would be legalized at the federal level. Now, he was talking about the legalization of marijuana, not what which is not what the MORE Act is doing. The MORE Act is the decriminalization, not the legalization, and there's a distinction between the two. Moving forward, he's hoping that this roadmap still could be applied, at least with the MORE Act. But that's a little tricky. If we look at what Marijuana Moment, a website that is obviously pro cannabis and the legalization of cannabis for recreational use, they published an article uh, last month, in September of last month, September 17th, that stated that the majority leader in the House for the Democrats was going to bring a vote on the MORE Act in late September. Well, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, that didn't happen. And there's still a question of when it's going to be put on the calendar for a vote. Now, the House Democrats do believe that they could get a floor vote by the end of the year, even if it's after the election. But that's still kind of a little close. So, what happens from now? Well, that's tricky. The election obviously will give us some type of indication of what's going to happen. But we should be mindful that uh, even if the Democrats control the House and control the Senate and control the White House, there's no guarantee that anything can be done on this topic. Um, the minorities still have a voice, and as we all know, the minority has ways to um, delay the discussion, the debate, and so forth. So um, while the likelihood of marijuana legislation being passed increases under a Biden presidency, it's no guarantee. So moving forward, I would encourage everybody to, of course, vote. Vote if this is an issue that you want to see passed or not passed. Vote accordingly, of course. But this is something that is not going to go away. In fact, what we're noticing is that the conversation is starting to intensify. And if the four states that have referendums on the ballot do end up legalizing marijuana, we can see for certain that it's the debate is just going to intensify. And considering that Senator Kamala Harris is a VP candidate, if she is elected with Joe Biden and they do take control of the White House, we could potentially see this being one of the top 5 issues that they move forward with in the first 100 days. Um, Now, it's not typical to work on 5 issues in the first 100 days. You usually work on 1 or 2. But I do believe that with Senator Kamala Harris having such a strong voice on this topic, considering that she wrote the piece of legislation, that we can see some major progress over the next year. So with that, feel free to provide any comments or feedback down below. If you liked the video, please subscribe and like, and I will be sure to update more videos on topics that you have an interest in. So until next time, YouTube, be well.